Welcome to the deep dive. We are moving past the headlines, past the high-level summaries, and directly into the source material you shared with us.
And today, our focus is on something really specific. It's not just a judicial process as a search for truth.
No, we are looking at how the law itself was meticulously transformed into a political weapon.
That's the core mission. We're dissecting the 1536 downfall of George Boleyn and his sister, Queen Anne. And for you to be truly well-informed about this pivotal moment in Tudor history, you have to move beyond the tragic spectacle.
Beyond the execution block.
Exactly, and examine the underlying machinery of accusation. We need to understand precisely how a sweeping political purge, the removal of an entire faction, was successfully disguised as a routine judicial process.
A process involving sexual treason, of all things?
Which was the perfect charge to guarantee public shock and moral outrage.
And the documents, the diplomatic dispatches, the indictments, and even the treasury records, they paint an incredibly calculating picture.
They really do.
The goal here is to see not just that the Boleyns were removed, but how. How the law was systematically bent and manipulated to achieve a crucial dynastic and political objective.
Which was clearing the deck for Henry VIII to marry Jane Seymour, and at the same time crushing Anne's powerful and to some very disruptive faction.
So where do we start? The story has so many moving parts.
We start where the calculation concluded, in the silence of the Tower. Your sources describe George Boleyn's final, desperate days confined in the Martin Tower, maybe even kneeling with irons at his wrists.
He would have known then. He understood the game was up.
He knew the justice system had been replaced by, well, legal theater. And the injustice, as the records reveal, it wasn't a sudden burst of royal rage. It wasn't Henry just losing his temper.
No, it was assembled. That's the word that stands out.
Assembled. By rumor, by whispered accusations, by commissions raised in private. All of this was done by people, primarily Thomas Cromwell, who had expertly studied the law and understood exactly how to make it serve the crown's immediate needs.
That distinction law serving calculation rather than justice, that's everything. And we're going to track that calculation through the surviving evidence.
We'll look at the specific dates in the indictments, the court rolls, the foreign chronicles, and even the details in the financial accounts.
We want you to see how an accusation was manufactured, retrofitted with false facts, and then given the undeniable, terrifying force of law.
And to understand the target, we have to understand his position first. It all begins with George Boleyn himself, because his background perfectly illustrates the delicate and frankly dangerous balance of the Tudor court.
Right. He was, as you put it in the notes, simultaneously indispensable.
And yet utterly expendable when political favor shifted.
Okay, let's unpack George Boleyn's profile then. He was the second surviving son of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard. But calling him simply a courtier, it really diminishes his intellectual capacity, doesn't it?
It does. This was not just a powerful family. It was a deeply cultivated one. It was infused with the emergent ideals of continental humanism. They were at the cutting edge of intellectual life.
So George received a top-tier education.
Absolutely. A truly excellent education, far exceeding what was necessary even for a noble of his rank. He was fluent, not just conversant, but fluent in French, Latin, and Italian.
And these weren't just for show, were they? These weren't parlor tricks.
Not at all. These were essential professional skills in the Tudor diplomatic sphere. His early career was spent almost exclusively in these crucial diplomatic roles, serving as an ambassador or envoy in France and elsewhere in Europe.
So what did the sources tell us about his effectiveness? Was he actually good at his job, or was this just a sinecure based on his family connections?
No, he was very good. Contemporary dispatches from those periods, especially from France, consistently remarked upon his acute intellectual capacity.
I think I saw a quote about his capacity for argument.
That's the one. And his facility with court life. He wasn't just decorative. He was a highly capable negotiator and administrator. He could hold his own against hardened foreign diplomats, and crucially, he was a trusted conduit for the king's own foreign policy objectives.
But then Anne's marriage to Henry VIII changes everything. It dramatically amplifies his position.
It catapults him. He goes from being an important diplomat to one of the most powerful men in the realm. He becomes Viscount Rochford and is stationed firmly within the Privy Chamber.
That's the most intimate, exclusive circle around the king.
The inner sanctum. This meant he was hunting, playing tennis, and debating high policy directly with Henry VIII.
That proximity to the king meant maximum power.
But also maximum vulnerability. The forces repeatedly highlight that his elevated position, based solely on his sister's marriage, exposed him to this intense, corrosive jealousy from the established nobility.
People who resented the Boleyn's sudden rapid rise.
Of course, they saw them as upstarts. And this privilege, it became his most dangerous liability because when the family fell out of favor, he had the furthest to drop.
And that fall was really accelerated by the factional rivalries, especially with Thomas Cromwell.
Yes, the Boleyn faction was more than just a family group. It had distinct political and ideological goals.
Right, they were characterized by their Protestant sympathies and their patronage of reform.
Exactly. And this is where George's diplomatic skills actually turned against him. We know from the sources that he actively used his diplomatic channels to move and circulate what were then considered banned texts.
So he's smuggling reformist literature.
Essentially, yes. This support for nascent Protestant ideas, the movement of books and ideas that challenged the established religious order, was a specific political liability.
Something his enemies could grab onto.
And they did. They could seize upon it to smear him with heresy and disloyalty, especially those clinging to the Catholic establishment.
This is where it gets structurally so interesting because the central political fight wasn't just about theology or even who the king was sleeping with.
No, it was deeply rooted in finance and institutional control.
Specifically, the dissolution of the monasteries.
That's the heart of it. The Boleyn Circle, influenced by these humanist and reforming ideals, sought to direct the vast new wealth that was about to be generated. They had very specific progressive goals for it.
What were they proposing?
They wanted to fund what they viewed as public goods. Anne's Circle argued vehemently that monastic revenues should be directed toward charitable and educational enterprises,
Like founding new schools, endowing university professorships.
providing poor relief. It was a direct extension of their reforming agenda, a vision for a more educated and more Protestant commonwealth.
But this put them on an immediate and really an unavoidable collision course with Thomas Cromwell. Why was Anne's influence so costly to his vision?
Because Cromwell, as the chief minister and the architect of the administrative state, had a singular pragmatic objective: centralized control.
He didn't want the money parceled out.
Not at all. He didn't want it going to charitable trusts or humanist professors. He sought the crown's direct control over those immense revenues.
Meaning they went straight into the royal treasury.
Straight in, which he could then manage for state expenses, military buildup, and his own administrative reforms. So Anne's influence became a significant, highly visible obstruction to his financial and administrative agenda.
The friction just hardens into political enmity.
It does. And as one of your sources noted, political calculations swiftly replaced the fragile bonds of alliance. They had been allies, but now their goals were fundamentally opposed.
So you have the ambitious, reform-minded Boleyn faction on one side.
The highly efficient, deeply frustrated, and politically powerful Cromwell on the other.
And then you add the final critical ingredient, Henry VIII's dynastic crisis.
Precisely. The political landscape in the early months of 1536 was defined by this absolute, suffocating urgency. Henry VIII's entire reign was fundamentally unstable until he produced a male heir.
And Anne had failed to do that.
She had provided Princess Elizabeth, yes. But then she suffered a devastating miscarriage in January 1536. And what's key here, for you to understand the context, is that this was a miscarriage of a son.
The stakes couldn't have been higher.
They couldn't. This failure, coupled with the king's desperate need for a prince, fundamentally altered the delicate balance at court overnight.
And the king's personal gaze immediately shifted.
Immediately. His attention turned toward Jane Seymour.
Whose quiet, deferential comportment, as the sources say, was the complete opposite of Anne's outspoken intellectual nature.
It was, and Cromwell, the consummate political operator, he immediately recognized this personal shift as his opportunity.
He sees his opening.
He does. He realized that the crown's dynastic need for a new queen, combined with the strategic necessity of subordinating the Boleyn faction that blocked his financial plans.
It gave him both the perfect motive and the administrative means to remove Anne and her entire circle in one swift motion.
The king's desire provided the pretext, the reason. Cromwell's machinery provided the hammer, the method.
That is the essential analytical takeaway from this first section. When the crown demanded a solution to its dynastic and political problems, Cromwell was the only man who could produce the highly detailed, complex, and plausible legal structure necessary for removal.
Exactly. And that transition brings us into the next part where we see that structure being built. And it's not improvised in a panic. It is deliberately and coldly constructed.
The sources strongly suggest that what followed was not a rushed improvisation. It was intense, premeditated preparation designed to create the illusion of legal process.
That's right.
So what were the early signs that this was a planned operation?
Well, the sequencing of events is the most damning proof of orchestration. We see the quiet raising of commissions in Middlesex and Kent.
Okay, why those specific locations?
That's the key. Middlesex was the county housing Westminster Hall, the heart of the legal system, and Kent was where Greenwich Palace, the current seat of the court, was located.
So where the accused lived and worked.
Precisely. By raising these commissions of inquiry and oyer and terminer in these jurisdictions, they provided the necessary legal ground to investigate and indict the court members right where they were.
And what did these commissions actually do in practical terms?
They were essentially executive tools, masked as judicial ones. They allowed the prosecution to bypass the regular grand jury processes and set the stage for special, politically appointed trials.
A legal shortcut.
A very effective one. Then you have the sudden, almost inexplicable cancellation of the king's planned royal travel in late April.
Why was that so important?
It kept the potential witnesses and the accused geographically dislocated and close to London, where the machinery was concentrated. No one could scatter or organize resistance. To contemporaries observing these calculated, non-random acts, there was a clear pattern of deliberate orchestration.
These weren't accidents.
No. These moves were the work of experienced officials who knew exactly how to place charges where they would stick.
And central to this orchestration was the strategic arrest of the most vulnerable people, the servants and musicians.
Yes, which opened the routes to forced confessions. And this brings us to the crucial role of the commoner, a man named Mark Smeaton.
Smeaton was a simple, low-ranking musician in the Queen's service.
But critically, he was a commoner. He was arrested in late April 1536 and immediately taken not to a normal prison, but to Thomas Cromwell's own house in London for interrogation.
And surprise, surprise, the subsequent records show he confessed to having committed adultery with the Queen.
They do.
We need to pause here and clarify the legal situation for you. If a confession was the goal, why didn't Cromwell just pressure one of the lesser nobles involved, like Sir Henry Norris or Sir Francis Weston? What made a commoner's coerced testimony so much more useful?
That is an excellent question that goes right to the heart of Tudor legal politics. The crucial legal distinction is one of class privilege.
It's all about status.
It is. A nobleman, a peer of the realm like George Boleyn, was protected by his status. He could not be subjected to physical torture or aggressive coercive duress to extract testimony. A commoner like Smeaton, however,
Had no such protection.
none at all. So his status made him immediately susceptible to the kind of interrogation that would produce a confession, regardless of its truth.
This makes Smeaton the ideal terrifying instrument.
He is. His confession is singular. He was the only accused person who admitted guilt. The prosecution could then present this coerced admission as an undeniable, factual anchor point for the entire case.
Right. Without Smeaton's forced admission of guilt, the whole thing would have fallen apart.
It would have. The entire prosecution structure would have lacked any public, tangible evidence, forcing the Crown to rely solely on gossip and circumstantial evidence against the nobles. His testimony supplied the crucial, necessary content to extend the allegations from simple adultery to a wider conspiracy of treason, implicating Anne's entire circle.
And that anchor point was instantly used to manufacture the most shocking and damning charge of all, incest, against George Boleyn.
Yes.
Targeting George with this specific lurid charge seems excessive, even within the context of total political destruction. What was the calculus there?
It was necessary for total and permanent political neutralization. George was not just Anne's brother. He was politically independent, educated, and well-connected.
So if Anne were removed for adultery, but George remained,
He could rally the reformist opposition. He could appeal to continental Protestant allies. He could potentially destabilize the subsequent Queen's position. He could still operate as a potent factional leader.
so the incest charge was designed for total annihilation of the Boleyn reputation.
Absolutely. It used lurid moral outrage, a transgression against nature itself, to instantly poison public opinion against the family and prevent any possibility of future faction rehabilitation, even years later. The goal was to render the Boleyn name permanently toxic.
And the indictment itself leans into that moral outrage, using intensely specific, even sexualized language to make the charges stick.
It's very graphic. It emphasizes acts like kissing, the use of tongues, the presenting of jewels as physical evidence.
And then it cites very specific dates: November and December of 1535, early January 1536. This shifted the case from mere policy disputes into the sensational, capital realm of moral depravity and treason.
But what's fascinating here and what really reveals the manipulation is that the very specificity of the indictment, which was meant to make it seem factual and legally robust, is actually what proves its complete fabrication.
The proof of fabrication is in the paperwork for those who checked it later.
Absolutely. When modern scholars, people like Eric Ives and Retha Warwick, consulted the other source material you provided, the household accounts, the diplomatic correspondence, detailed royal itineraries, they found critical misalignment.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. The alleged meeting on December 10th is contradicted by records showing Anne was demonstrably at Greenwich that day, miles from George's documented location. On other cited dates, the king's household records show George was attending to duties miles away.
So these specific, dramatic dates that were supposed to prove intimacy were, in fact, politically convenient inventions.
Precisely. This factual inconsistency undermines the plausibility of the indictment entirely. But in the climate of May 1536, the indictment, once sealed by the commissions, had the force of law and political necessity, regardless of its factual consistency.
Its immediate function was just to justify execution and eliminate sympathy.
And it worked. The arrests themselves followed this calculated pattern of efficiency. Anne was arrested at Greenwich after a session of tennis, which symbolizes the sudden, shocking rupture of royal favor.
And George?
George, having rushed to Whitehall upon hearing rumors, was arrested quietly and deliberately shortly thereafter. Some historians think he walked right into a trap.
The rapidity was key.
It was. George was immediately confined in the Martin Tower, and the prosecution secured a critical advantage through the immediate silence that descended.
Meaning what, exactly?
There are virtually no records of direct communication between the accused during their confinement. This silence prevented them from coordinating a unified defense, it stopped them from communicating with foreign allies, and it allowed the prosecutors to completely control the narrative through those previously established commissions and their extracted, coerced confessions. The king's government had effectively quarantined its victims.
It truly was a transformation of law into pure political adjudication, and the speed of it is terrifying.
It is.
The timeline was brutally compressed. Anne arrested on May 2nd, the key trials on May 12th and 15th, and then execution within days.
13 days. 13 days of what historians rightly call a rapid-fire judicial purge.
And that speed confirms the political purpose. The court at Westminster Hall and the special commissions of Oyer and Terminer.
They were just instruments. Instruments designed to ensure the accusation had the appearance of legitimate adjudication. These trials served a political function, validating the king's desire for a new queen, rather than a judicial one aimed at determining guilt.
And for George, his status as a nobleman, which should have afforded him a trial by his peers.
A jury of equals drawn from the House of Lords.
That was just summarily circumvented. How was that customary protection bypassed?
Well, the special commissions of Oyer and Terminer were used to override the default system. They could convene quickly and were highly susceptible to administrative pressure. The prosecution structured the process so that George was tried under these special, targeted procedures, limiting the customary protections peers were usually afforded in treason cases.
This was a manipulation of process reaching a new level of sophistication.
All whole new intensity in Tudor administrative history.
Yes. And the composition of the judging body was critical to securing the desired outcome. You noted that the jury was far from neutral.
It was completely stacked. It reflected the court's established interests and, more importantly, its current fears.
Who was on it?
The body included George's own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. These men were powerful, but they were bound by their alliance to Henry VIII and were driven by the absolute necessity of self-preservation.
They were never neutral arbiters.
Not for a second. They were instruments of the king's political will, keenly aware that their own survival depended on securing a guilty verdict.
And the evidence presented to this stacked jury was, as you said, flimsy, based on intercepted gossip, coerced confessions, and the testimony of a vulnerable servant, Mark Smeaton.
This procedural choice fundamentally redefined justice as a function of political survival. The Crown could introduce rumors and force testimony as hard proof of treason.
So Anne was tried first.
She was. And despite delivering what observers described as a remarkably precise and dignified defense, she was swiftly convicted. The rhetoric that followed her condemnation was a political necessity for the Crown. meant to close off any avenue for popular sympathy.
And then it was George's turn.
When George faced his trial on May 15th, the assembly was massive, it was theatrical, and the outcome was entirely prejudged.
Yet, despite the certainty of doom, he mounted a truly formidable, clear-headed defense. What did contemporary observers note about his performance?
The foreign diplomatic corps, who are often the most skeptical witnesses, were deeply impressed. Yes. Lancelot de Dinteville, the French secretary, specifically remarked on George's composure and the logical force of his argument. He even compared him favorably in his demeanor to the recently executed Thomas More. Very high praise. George answered each charge both prudent and wise, systematically maintaining that the lurid allegations were false and impossible.
So why mount such a defense when the odds of acquittal were zero? If the jury was stacked and the process manipulated, what was the point of arguing?
It was a conscious historical act. George, as a man of letters, well steeped in scripture, debate, and the humanist tradition, he couldn't simply submit to the lie. But more critically, he sought to create a counter-record for posterity.
He was playing for the history books.
He was delivering a public denial that was so detailed and so forceful that it could not be easily suppressed later by the state's official chronicle. He was aiming his words beyond the immediate courtroom toward history itself.
And the most consequential moment of the entire trial, the point of absolute calculated rupture, came during his defense, focusing on a small, folded piece of paper.
Yes. The court handed it to him, but explicitly ordered him not to read it aloud.
And he did it anyway.
In an incredible act of audacity and defiance, George defiantly read the note aloud to the assembled crowd before his judges could physically stop him.
What was on the paper?
It contained sensitive, career-ending gossip concerning the king's own sexual capacity, referencing persistent rumors of Henry's impotence or inability to perform.
Wow. That not only risked royal wrath by publicly mocking Henry's masculinity, but it also instantaneously punctured the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative.
It was simultaneously defiant and profoundly explanatory. The legal logic was simple. The core of the treason case against Anne was that she had committed adultery with 5 men and incest with her brother because the king was infertile or incapable of satisfying her.
So if he could suggest the king's potency was questionable,
The whole rationale for Anne's alleged rampant adultery became significantly less plausible in the eyes of any rational observer or foreign ambassador.
so this was not accidental bravery, it was a strategic sacrificial exposure.
It absolutely was. He knew the verdict was sealed, but by making the king's most personal humiliation public, he ensured that the weak, manufactured foundation of the treason charges would be immediately visible.
To the foreign ambassadors who you mentioned were there.
Who indeed noted the audacious act in their dispatches, and to the chroniclers. He was targeting memory and the documentary record.
He realized he couldn't alter the immediate predetermined outcome.
But he could absolutely shape the memory of the proceedings, guaranteeing that the instrumental political nature of the prosecution would not be successfully hidden under the guise of justice. That singular act of defiance left an indelible impression on those present and ensured that George's downfall was recorded as an act of political violence, not criminal adjudication.
That strategic use of public exposure transitions us perfectly into the lasting legacy of this compressed timeline of legal aggression, a legacy that haunted the Tudor court long after George Boleyn was buried.
The timeline itself is a testament to the administrative efficiency of the purge. Arrest to execution in just 13 days. The men were sentenced to the grotesque hanging, drawing, and quartering, the standard penalty for treason.
Though this was commuted to simple beheading for the nobles.
Yes, but that commutation, you have to remember, was a function of their status and custom, not of the king's personal mercy or any doubt regarding their guilt.
The spectacle of public death on Tower Hill was less punitive than performative, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was designed explicitly to warn potential dissenters and demonstrate the terrifying reach of royal power. But the public reaction was not universally accepting.
The chroniclers recorded significant unease.
They did. Civic sensibilities were disturbed precisely because these were known, prominent nobles and courtiers. These were men who had been the king's companions, not anonymous criminals taken off the street. There was a sense that if it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone.
And that unease was crucially reinforced by George's final words on the scaffold, which again were highly calculated.
It's very calculated. He followed the scaffold convention, a general confession of human sin and a warning to courtiers about the vanity of earthly ambition.
But he made a very distinctive move.
He did. He affirmed his Protestant convictions and insisted that his efforts in life had been dedicated to promoting the gospel.
So, critically, he admitted to general human sinfulness, as was expected, but he conspicuously did not confess to the specific capital crimes of incest or treason.
Never. And this was a deliberate moral counter-narrative. By framing his death in terms of faith and generalized fallibility, rather than criminal depravity and specific lurid acts, he fundamentally complicated the prosecution's simple narrative of guilt and depravity.
And the ambassadors and chroniclers present recorded this speech.
They did, which served to protect his memory and make it far more difficult for later generations to simply accept the official story provided by the crown.
We have to address the great scapegoat of this entire episode. Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, George's wife.
Yeah.
Popular history, particularly dramatic fiction, often casts her as the vengeful, jealous woman who deliberately testified against her husband, leading directly to his execution.
That narrative, while emotionally satisfying and dramatic, is historically flimsy and largely contradicted by the available sources.
What's the evidence against that story?
Well, the evidence for her betrayal is weak and often retrospective. It originates in later, non-contemporaneous narratives that sought a simpler villain. Surviving letters from the period actually show Jane Parker writing consolations to her husband and acting as a mourner after the executions.
Which indicates anxiety and grief, not vengeful plotting.
Exactly. Historians like Julia Fox have strongly challenged this myth of the treacherous wife.
So what was her actual position, based on the records we have?
Her position was one of extreme, almost unbearable political anxiety. She was a woman caught in the eye of a political hurricane, trying desperately to salvage her own security and position against the overwhelming forces of an administration determined to remove the Boleyn faction.
Her fate was tied to his.
Entirely. She became a convenient historical scapegoat, precisely because it was psychologically easier for later chroniclers and the public to blame a treacherous wife than it was to confront the systemic institutional violence that the state employed to orchestrate the purge.
The historical consensus relies heavily on the perspective provided by external accounts, which you've mentioned repeatedly. Why are these foreign sources so vital to our understanding?
They provide the essential cross-check against the domestic English records, which, as we've said, were often manipulated instruments of the administration.
Right.
The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis and the French secretary Lancelot de Carles, whose poem account of the trials provided a scathing perspective, consistently expressed astonishment and skepticism.
At what specifically?
At the sheer speed and implausibility of the incest and adultery charges. They were essentially saying, in diplomatic terms, this is obviously a setup.
So their accounts support the modern consensus.
They do. That the charges were politically motivated constructs, built on brittle foundations of gossip and coercion, orchestrated solely to achieve a dynastic necessity. Without those external diplomatic dispatches, we would have been forced to rely almost entirely on the official prepackaged narrative created by Cromwell's administration.
And this brings us to the final, terrible, and most instructive irony of this whole affair. The fate of the man who built the machine.
Thomas Cromwell.
He achieved his immediate objective. He removed Anne, installed Jane Seymour. But just 4 years later, in 1540, Cromwell himself was arrested and executed.
And the charges bear the exact stamp of political calculation and legal engineering.
The parallel is chilling and unavoidable.
It is. Cromwell was charged with treason via heresy and abuse of power. Just as he used commissions and special bills of attainder to bypass the normal legal protections for the Boleyns, those same structural tools, the very mechanisms of legal aggression he refined, were turned against him.
The system he perfected ended up consuming him.
The charges against him were constructed rapidly, evidence was thin, and his execution was ensured before he had any realistic chance to mount a meaningful defense. It's the ultimate demonstration of the volatility of royal favor and the structural weakness of Tudor justice.
The same system that permitted law to be used as a political weapon inevitably turned back on its maker.
The institutional design that allowed the Boleyn purge to happen did not spare its architect. In fact, he had made it sharper and faster for his own execution.
That is the enduring lesson of the Boleyn purge, isn't it? It transcends the personalities involved.
It's a case study in how institutional design enabled political purges. Cromwell created an administrative state capable of producing legal violence on demand. The combination of moral outrage focusing on sexual deviancy, which always guaranteed public shock and legal framing, using the capital charge of treason made prosecution swift and efficient.
But by making the legal process solely dependent on the crown's political preference, they fundamentally eroded confidence in judicial fairness for everyone, including themselves.
Precisely. Even the partial rehabilitation that came later under Elizabeth I, who reversed some decrees and restored her mother's memory, underscores the ultimate contingency of reputation.
Meaning the facts can change.
The legal facts created by Cromwell's machinery in 1536 were temporary. They could be rewritten over time when the political climate changed. But the structural damage to the principle of fair justice remained.
So to sum up, our deep dive into the sources reveals that George Boleyn's downfall was not a genuine criminal trial.
No, it was an engineered legal event driven by desperate dynastic anxiety, factional rivalry, and ministerial opportunism.
Culminating in that calculated, unforgettable act of public defiance from George himself. It shows us the terrifying efficiency of law when it is unmoored from justice.
And the source material clearly indicates that the legal mechanisms used to destroy the Boleyns were later deployed to destroy their architect, Thomas Cromwell, and would continue to be used by succeeding monarchs.
Which raises an important question for you to mull over.
In any highly centralized system, when the law is permitted to be bent by preference and faction, is the resulting cycle of purge and retribution inevitable? What does this recurring pattern tell us about the structural security of justice, not just in the Tudor era, but even today, when power demands quick solutions?